this is the anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 60th. A lot is being made about it. Now, I'm going to go over a bit of an article from published in RT, but from Tony Cox, who's a former Bloomberg reporter. It's not the best, so I'm not going to go over all of it because I don't think its politics really demonstrate the importance of that moment at all. But we are in the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that crisis is now, there is now a comparison being made. You had Joe Biden say that Russia is bringing the world closer to nuclear war. You have that scenario going on where the United States is saying that Russia is provoking nuclear war. It's a huge problem. It's incredibly wrong. It's not true. Russia is actually trying to de-escalate, as hard as that may seem. Russia is trying to de-escalate. It's tried so hard to negotiate a settlement, but the United States and the collective West has said no. So the military situation is getting intense, and surely if NATO wants to continue to push in this direction and talk like this, then the possibility of nuclear confrontation goes up, of course. But to me, I think this comparison is interesting because in both cases, the wrong side is being blamed for the provocation. And so I want to go over this article really quickly. I won't be reading too much from it, but I do want to share this, all right? And so this guy, Tony Cox, he wrote on the Edge of Armageddon, why is the Ukraine conflict is dangerously similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we're at the 60th anniversary of this, and he talks about, all right, so on October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy of the United States at the time received information from the CIA about the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba. This event was the formal beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the first for a long time, the only event in world history that brought humanity to the brink of nuclear war. Back then, cool heads who had not yet forgotten the horrors of real war were able to prevent a catastrophe. Whether today's leaders will show the same restraint is far from certain. So he goes, he talks about history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. Mark Twain said this. Tariq Ali, Pakistani British historian, said, history rarely repeats itself, but its echoes never go away. So he said either could have been referring to today's Russia-Ukraine conflict, which seems to be rhyming with and echoing a perilous episode from 60 years ago and 6,000 miles away, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Observers who recall the U.S.-Soviet showdown in 1962 of October can only hope that the latest confrontation between Washington and Moscow doesn't require as much luck to avert a potentially planetary ending nuclear war. The similarities, rhymes, and echoes are evident. For starters, the Ukraine and Cuban crises were both rooted, at least partially, in the same principle. A superpower can't stand idly by when a geopolitical rival sets up or upsets the security balance between them. In 1962, the trigger was the secret placement of Soviet missiles in Cuba, right on America's doorstep. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, who ironically grew up in what was Ukraine, saw the move as a way to protect the island against U.S. invasion after the failed Bay of Pigs assault in 1961 of April, as well as a tit-for-tat response to the Pentagon's deployment of Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, which positioned Washington's nuclear heads to hit the USSR's territory in as few as 10 minutes. At the time, the long-range missiles in Soviet territory took hours to fuel up and fire, meaning a delayed response to a U.S. first strike. Since the Americans have already surrounded the Soviet Union with a ring of military installations, we should pay them back in their own coin and give them a taste of their own medicine so they find out for themselves how it feels to be targeted by nuclear arms. Khrushchev was quoted as saying to Alexander Alexeyev, then Moscow's ambassador to Cuba. So President John F. Kennedy didn't see it that way when a U-2 spy plane spotted surface-to-surface missiles in Cuba on October 16th. As Ukrainian-born author Sergei Polekov wrote in a 2021 book, Nuclear Folly, Kennedy was initially inclined to order an attack on the missile sites, which could have escalated a Soviet response, and even mushroom clowns on both sides. He was not aware yet that Soviet Union had nuclear warheads in Cuba, nor did he know that the USSR had 43,000 troops on the island, as well as tactical nukes that could be used to destroy a US attack force. But Kennedy knew that having Soviet ballistic missiles just across the Florida Straits, with Havana only about 1,100 miles from Washington and 200 from Miami, was intolerable and gave the USSR the ability to win a nuclear war with the US. So the one thing I don't like about this is it makes out the Soviet Union to be the aggressor. All right. I think the comparison is apt. All right. I think the comparison is a good one. Okay. But the Soviet Union was not the aggressor then, and Russia is not the aggressor now. So I'm not going to read this whole article. I just wanted to give you some indication of what, because all of the things that he's going to go over, we know about in terms of Russia raising concerns about Article 5 of NATO's constitution, the expansion of NATO, all of that. That's well known now. But I wanted to go over this comparison a bit because I think it is an interesting one. First, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened during the Cold War, and as this article already said, the United States had militarily encircled the Soviet Union. It did more than that. It actually cut off the Soviet Union technologically from much of the world, and it tried to strangle its military capacity. Didn't work out too well. The Soviet Union, by that time, by Khrushchev's period, was already an industrial powerhouse, had basically recovered from World War II, despite being at a level below, forced to a level below technologically because of imperialist sanctions. But the military encirclement was real, and the war provocations were very real. Many may not know this, but the nuclear weapons dropped on Japan were a message to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union saw them as such. And all of the US's actions in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America at that time were all geared toward the Soviet Union, preparing for a confrontation. So the United States wanted to dismember the Soviet Union then, and this moment was provoked by the United States. And so, yes, we could argue maybe it wasn't the smartest thing. But at the same time, this article, and it doesn't go into it afterward either, it actually has some really anti-Cuba, anti-Castro stuff I don't even want to put out there because we've heard it all before. But Cuba and the Soviet Union were good friends, right? They were allies, and Cuba and the Soviet Union had this relationship, and Cuba honestly appreciated the support because of what happened. I hate when journalists, American, Western, mainstream journalists, undermine the significance of certain events, like the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a terrorist invasion of Cuba to try to overthrow the government. So Cuba being welcoming of Soviet military aid was not surprising. What was surprising was that the United States, or maybe not surprising, but what I think startled people, was that the United States immediately, literally almost, it was very close. The U.S. political administration under John F. Kennedy almost pulled the trigger. It wasn't the Soviet Union that almost pulled the trigger to launch an attack on Washington. It was the United States that almost pulled the trigger. And of course, now it's seen as, well, John F. Kennedy pulled back, said, no, we're not going to do this. But there were a lot of people who wanted it. And he was one of them in the beginning. So let's not talk about how the Soviet Union was the aggressor, how Cuba was the aggressor. We need to get those facts straight. But the parallel to me is that it's the same thing with what's happening with Russia. Russia is now being seen as the nuclear threat. Indeed, Russia has more nuclear weapons than the United States. But the United States has been the only world power in history to use them twice, to threaten them multiple times, almost too many to count, but we can just name some. During the open military conflict invasion of Korea, during Vietnam, and it did so multiple times with China and with the Soviet Union as well. So there's many times to count about using nuclear weapons that the United States could be cited on. But no, it's Russia, right? But then there's also the fact that Article 5 of NATO's constitution says if a NATO country is attacked, quote unquote, then all partners are obligated to defend that NATO country. And the United States has nuclear sharing agreements with almost all of these countries in NATO, and now it's adding Poland to the mix. So Russia, with Ukraine right on its border, would have a lot of reason to worry about Ukraine possibly joining NATO, which was a central question in the escalations that occurred from December into February. It was, is Ukraine really going to join NATO? You just had Zelensky begging for it. The US and NATO, the EU, etc., said no. But this was a very real possibility, and it still could be a real possibility at some point if Ukraine isn't completely obliterated before it happens, right? There is a flirtation with this, despite the fact that NATO expansion has been a key point of the Russian government saying, stop this. You said in 1991 you were going to stop this. Now you're not stopping this. You are actually continuing to expand, right? Doubling in size in now 30 countries, right? Including Sweden and Finland recently, which Finland shares a border with Russia. So these are all very serious provocations, but to compare Russia to the Soviet Union, both of these countries, both of these projects, to compare them to each other in a way that makes them out to be the aggressors, I think is dishonest. Because I think the real problem is that both the Soviet Union and Russia were provoked, and that out of self-defense, they felt compelled to take stronger military action. That's what I believe is the lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the lesson of the current military operation in Ukraine, is that if you push countries too far, then there's going to be an eventual confrontation. And so that should be the lesson, right? The lesson should be, we need to be against nuclear war of any kind. We need to demand first and foremost that the United States disarm its nuclear arsenal, as being the only country to ever use them, as being an empire that's not afraid to go to war, as being the central reason why other countries, China, Russia, on and on, have nuclear weapons in the first place. Many people might not remember, in the early 1960s, China pursued nuclear weapons because of the threat that the United States posed of using nuclear weapons against them. It had already been threatened against them in the Taiwan Straits crises, the first and the second. And Daniel Ellsberg revealed in all of the details about the second. So that's the root cause of the nuclear buildup, right? The nuclear arms race. During the Cold War for the Soviet Union, it was the same thing. It was building up the deterrence capacity to defend yourself should the United States do the unthinkable, because it had done it before. So that should be first and foremost the lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it should be the lesson about the special military operation that Russia is waging in Ukraine. That the U.S.'s meddling, interference, direct interference militarily, covertly, politically, all of it has led us to this moment, and has led us to, right, there are not many more minutes to midnight, right, has led us to this brink. And first and foremost, we need to be calling for the United States to be the one to withdraw, the United States to be the one to cease its endless aggression. That is what I see as the problem.